nothing more irritating than making a coffee or a cup of tea or whatever and going to the fridge and finding that you've run out of milk or whatever it might be. So often we don't even think about whether we've got enough in the background or not, whether we've got enough in storage or not. We'll go ahead and decide to do something or decide to make something and then suddenly decide that we haven't got the things to do it. We suddenly look in the cupboard and realise you haven't got what it takes. Because you haven't planned, because you haven't thought about it, and you haven't given care for what's coming. I must confess I find it quite irritating when you go out with people and they'll get somewhere and then suddenly realise they haven't got any cash on them and they'll disappear off to a bank machine. Once upon a time that would have been impossible. You had to go to the bank once a week and you got your money out for the week and that was it. You had to go during banking hours and you got your cash. It's all very different these days. You don't need to worry about it anymore. You just go off to the bank machine when you need to and there it is. At least you hope there it is. Sometimes there isn't. But generally speaking, people don't worry about that sort of thing much. They don't plan, do they, very much? But imagine how the world would be if we didn't plan at all. If we didn't worry, if we didn't do a proper weekly shop, we wouldn't have enough food to feed the kids. We'd soon run out. If we didn't plan ahead, we wouldn't have enough to live on in our retirement, perhaps. If we didn't plan ahead, we'd never be able to get the best bargains on holiday. If we didn't plan ahead, everything would soon fall apart. And our modern society just wouldn't work unless there's proper planning and unless you get everything sorted and make sure you've got enough supplies in and make sure you know who's doing what and where everything's coming from. And yet we're told not to think about tomorrow. We're told not to worry about what we're going to eat. We're told not to plan ahead. But what does it really mean? We obviously do need to plan ahead to some extent. We obviously need to plan our lives. We obviously need to plan the way things are going so that we can get the best result. And yet, I think it's all too easy for us to be overcome by anxiety. We spend so much time worrying about what might happen. We spend so much time worrying about the future. We spend so much time being afraid that something might go wrong. And we tend to obsess about all the things that might go wrong. And if we're not careful, we can be consumed by anxiety, worrying. And it's not difficult to think of people like this. I suspect most of us probably know people like this who worry so much about what might happen that they end up actually achieving nothing much. They're frightened of the wider world and they're frightened of other people very often. And in a large anonymous society like ours, it's understandable, I suppose, why people tend to be wary of strangers and why people tend to be wary of other people to some extent. But if we're not careful, we can become so paralysed by fear that we never actually achieve anything. We spend so much time in a state of anxiety that it all becomes rather unhealthy and rather negative. And indeed, people who are consumed by anxiety will often end up behaving in rather strange and unpredictable ways, simply because they can't actually relax and get on with normal life. They're so worried about what might happen. Anxiety can be a great killer. Anxiety can be a great destroyer of people and of societies and of communities. We need sometimes to learn to relax and just accept things. And I think this is what Jesus is trying to say to us, that we shouldn't be so anxious that we end up being paralysed by fear. We don't really need to fear in quite that way. And the collect tells us that we're actually made in the image of God. We have prayed that we will then see the likeness of God's image in other people. And so what does this mean? What is God like? How can we see God's image in other people? What is it that we're looking for? We're told that God is love. Throughout the New Testament, we're constantly told that God is love. So we're looking for love in others, perhaps. We're looking for love in ourselves. It's the love of others that really is God coming into our midst that really is God being in us, that really is God reflected in our lives, if only we can learn to love others. And yet it's not always easy, is it? Because sometimes other people are so consumed by anxiety or whatever that they're actually rather negative and they're not actually always very lovable. Sometimes perhaps we have to stop worrying about what these people might do to us, what harm they might do, and just be prepared to accept them for what they are, and hopefully see the love in them. Hopefully look beyond the surface. And we can make a great effort to do this by loving others, by putting ourselves out and stopping and thinking sometimes. Instead of being critical of other people when they do something we don't like or with which we don't agree, sometimes it's better to stop and think. And you can see very often that these people sometimes are rather unhelpful or rather negative because they're actually themselves consumed with anxiety. Anxiety and stress seem to be one of the biggest problems in our society. They destroy people's confidence in one another. But if we stop and think that perhaps that other person who's behaving in ways we don't like is themselves consumed by anxiety and fear, maybe it will take time and patience to overcome that anxiety and fear. And hopefully, if we're prepared to love them, it'll bring out the love in them. And we can see God's love working in them, and hopefully it will come through us. So when we say we're made in the image of God, we're talking about the love that flows out of us to others, and that builds bridges between people. And as we are discerning the image of God in others, hopefully it will help them to become more loving and better people. And in this way, perhaps the world won't be so consumed by anxiety. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.